name is Maxine Mawhinney, and I'm going to host this session with my very old friend and former colleague, Tim Marshall. It's great to see you all here. Can I check that the phones are off, please? I mean, you can take pictures, you can tweet, but make sure you're on silent. There's nothing worse, is there? So you're in for a real treat this morning, because I've read the book. And Tim said to me earlier, oh, but it's quite depressing. It's not. Wait till you hear this. Tim Marshall.
Thank you.
I'll do a little bit of housekeeping.
Yeah, I'll sit down.
And just before we start, so you know what we're going to do? Tim is going to give us a presentation about the book, then I'm going to chat him to death, and then you guys can ask some questions as well. So get those questions ready while you're listening to the presentation. Thank you. Tim.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for coming. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the presence of Maxine, which I'm really happy about because she's a cheerful optimist, and she needs to balance me. I'm still cheerful, but I'm not an optimist anymore. I'm not a pessimist either, but I do think we are in an interesting period, a very interesting period, and a period of my generation we haven't actually seen before in our lifetimes. Hence, I think why, thankfully, one or two people have bought my books, because I think there's some context. There's going to be a presentation, so I'm really sorry for those of you sitting there who can't see the screen. I shall mime bits of it. This is a wall, okay? It is a bit depressing, forgive me. There is spiritual guidance from Kev the Rev, should you desire it. He's the chap with the white thing here. Handkerchiefs available on the way out. There's a test as well. Anyone? There's a social contract here between the two. They have decided they are comfortable being so close, their faces being so close to one another. If you don't know the person next to you, don't try it. Do try it at home. But the point being that they have agreed the amount of space between them. They haven't. Again, the point being, and you've seen this on the TV when they come up against each other, and this is just I just wanted to have an example of what I regard as a truism, that we all need our space. I then extrapolate from that, and you might think wrongly, that if we agree that we need our space, then we are simply arguing about how much space and what is in between us. But I think you can't argue against it that we need and like our space. And for those of you who are completely and totally, utterly committed to tearing down borders, I admire you. Do report back to me when you go home tonight. Ring the doorbell of your neighbor. Say you've had a great idea. You know that fence in the back garden? Tear it down. If he's called Mr. Gorbachev, it's even Mr. Gorbachev, tear down our back garden fence. And you won't, because we like our borders. It's an unpalatable truth. Those of us who think we are deeply liberal, we are also still animals. Another film quiz. 2001, A Space Odyssey. From the beginning, the first part of the trilogy in 4 parts, where the proto-humans approach each other from the watering hole. They're not going to share it. I'm afraid they fight over it. If one side had had a hod and a cement mixer and a trowel, they could have built a wall, but they didn't. We've come a long way since then, but we still threw nuclear weapons at each other in the last century, and we still see what's going on around the world now. So we have come a long way. We haven't come far enough. The difference being we have the capacity to understand about sharing, and we didn't then. It's been a very long journey. About 12,000 years ago, we stopped being hunter-gatherers. We began to stop. The first of us began farming. And the moment we stopped, well, you're sedentary. All the things that I love are now in one place. And at that point, we started building walls. The first of them started about 12,000 years ago. This is 5,000 years ago in Jericho. But if you've got something and you are unsure about the world around you, you build a wall around it. And if your neighbor comes and says, our crops have failed, we need yours, and you don't know what's going to happen next year with the weather, whatever, you say no. And at that point, when you haven't got enough, you think you haven't got enough to share, conflict arises. We've done it at all times. Constantinople, Hadrian's Wall, Great Wall of China, you name it. We've built walls throughout our recorded history. It's now a global phenomenon. Well, it always was, but I think there's a mistake in public perception of the walls. We tend to think only in terms of Trump and some of the fences in Europe. This is global. 65 countries wall or fence themselves off from their neighbors. That's a third of all the countries in the world. And I think that might come as a surprise to you. It came as a surprise to me. A third of all countries now, because we think we live in this open, globalized world. And my book is a slight counterpoint to that, slightly arguing, again depressingly, that globalization has made the world flat in terms of communication and trade, but I think the barriers in our minds and the physical ones are still there. If I click a button and someone in Shanghai puts something into a parcel and I get it 3 days later, that's not global unity. That's just trade. India-Bangladesh border, 3,000 miles or 3,000 kilometers. Every part of it is fenced or walled or guarded. The whole 3,000 miles. India has wrapped its fence around Bangladesh. It has guards, watchtowers, machine guns, lasers in the water ravines, so you break the laser beam through the water, the bits they can't build the wall or the fence on. 15 million Bangladeshis have moved across into the Indian border states like Assam just this century. 15 million people. This has upset the equilibrium and the demographics, leading to race riots between mostly Assam and non-Assam, to a lesser extent Hindu versus Muslim, and there's been quite a high death toll. So it's a global phenomenon. This is not just a Western thing. Saudi Arabia, well, I'll go through some later. This is the border between the EU and Africa. It's a very useful thing, Maila and Quetta, I think it's called. Little bit of Africa that is forever Spain. It's always worth bringing it up if you ever talk to a Spanish person and they're arguing with you about Gibraltar. So, I'm not making a case for or against either, but it's always very useful. So yeah, but what about... There are currently 1.2 billion people in Africa. By 2050-60, there's supposed to be 2.4 billion. Now, I am not convinced that the continent, which is booming in some areas, I'm not convinced it has the capacity to build an extra 1 billion homes, hospitals, schools, etc. We have already seen the rate of movement. It's going to increase quite rapidly, probably. We haven't come anywhere near peak migration, which is what is building most of these walls. It's the movement of peoples, and that's going to continue, which means we've got to have a very open and honest discussion with ourselves and our politicians and ask themselves, as people are moving, how many do we need? How many do we want? Who do we want? Personally, I want Liberal Democrats, not in a political party sense, in a social sense. I would like more Liberal Democrats to come, people who believe in certain parameters. Then ask your politicians, how many schools and hospitals are you going to build, and houses? We have a massive housing shortage. How many are you going to build to take the people that are coming? And then you listen to their answers. And then you finally say, and how are you going to pay for this? And if our politicians cannot answer these questions, I'd be very suspicious of them. When we're having this debate, we need to be asking these questions. Refugees, we have, I believe, a moral imperative to open our hearts and doors. Economic migrants, I think if you wish to see a rapid turn to the extremes, have open migration. We've seen it right across Europe. 93 MPs AFD in the German parliament, Sweden Democrats on the rise. Mrs. Le Pen got 34% in the French election, the Front National, now called the Front. And the narrative has been, as it was with the Dutch election, the Swedish election, and other elections, that Europe is pushing back against the extremes. In what way? Is doubling her father's vote, Jean-Marie Le Pen, against Chirac in 2001. He got 17%. I don't think a doubling of the fascist vote is pushing back against it. Hungary, same. We have our own walls. Anyone? Not Maxine? Belfast. You know, we are not immune from this. Forgive me, those of you in the house of God are using such an awful word about some of your fellow co-religionists from a different flavor. But, you know, as long as that's there. And you ask a lot of people in Belfast, near the walls, do you want them torn down? They say no, because they know they're not ready yet. The wall works. We don't like walls. We are inherently, most of us, against them on a moral basis, but I think it might be immoral to tear that one down because of the amount of petrol bombs, attacks, insults that are hurled through it. We're just not ready yet. The English are at it as well. Dodgy lot. Chinese are at it. In fact, well, they didn't start it, but this is a magnificent structure. 12,000 miles, because it's triple reinforced. That's like building a wall from New York to San Francisco and back again, and then back to San Francisco, and then back to New York, and then have a little bit extra for Maine or Connecticut. I mean, what an incredible feature it is. It's also one of the first massive manifestations of the us and the them. This side is civilization, double cropping, rice, cities, writing, the Han Chinese, Middle Kingdom. The other side of it is the steppe and the barbarians and the nomads. And this has been a central thought in Chinese thought ever since. About 90% of Chinese are Han. It's a very homogeneous ethnic society. The minorities are the Tibetans and the Uyghurs, etc., and Manchurians and people. It's a very divided country. This is where the Han live, on the right-hand side. They dominate these areas. As you can see, that's a clear division, because the minorities are out there. There's another clear division in income, the huge divide, whereas the eastern seaboard, has a much higher, better economy, and they know that they could break up if they don't alter this. How do they keep China together? By dividing them. Very Orwellian. You probably have heard of the Great Firewall of China, which divides China from the rest of the world, from the internet. You can't go on Facebook, you can't go on Twitter, etc., etc. And it's pretty good, and they're building it even more strongly. But fewer people know that there's another wall inside China. Xinjiang, top right there, is Uyghur Muslim area. And they've built another firewall around that so that Xinjiang can't talk to Tibet on the internet, because Tibet has its independence movement, Xinjiang has its independence movement, and they can't get them to talk to each other. That might be dangerous. So you divide the Chinese from each other, especially the minorities. They divide the chat rooms. You can only have a certain number. Because if I say, comrades, 20 of us in the village square tomorrow, the party can deal with that. If in my chat room there's 250,000 of us, and I say, comrades, on this village square tomorrow, the town square, that's a problem for the party. So the party only allows a certain amount of people to be unified in groups. They're brilliant at this, the best in the world, and second only to China in using the internet for disinformation and to divide us from each other. This is the one that gets the headlines. Interesting, that's the old border of the United States before the Texan War. So that all used to be part of Mexico. The whole lot beneath that line there was Mexico. And in American minds of a certain bent that believe that America should be a white place, an English-speaking place, and a Christian place, and there is a core racist vote that believes that, despite what the American Constitution says, they know that history, and they know that those states there in 20 or 30 years will be possibly majority Hispanic speaking. So that division is geographic, but it also divides you in your mind, and Trump has played on this. Trump has played on the core vote that worries about white people becoming a minority in the United States. And things like that add to that. Here is the wall, such as it is, wall and fence. Huge gaps in it all over the place. Obama reinforced it. Obama also doubled the amount of deportations compared to Bush, but he has a much more acceptable presence, so people didn't really cover that. But the amount of doors that used to get kicked in at dawn and deportations doubled under Obama. And it's important to know things like that to get a perspective of what the orange monster is doing. Because yes, he's awful, but so are many people. Yes, many of the policies are awful, but did you know that Mexico deports more Central Americans every year than the United States does? Did you know that the Mexican Constitution clearly says at a certain point we don't want anyone that isn't Mexican to come and live here? There's a racism built into the Mexican Constitution. And I think it's important to know these things to try and get a context of what this guy's doing. Sorry, not this guy. This is someone who doesn't like him. This is the fault. This is the problem with Trump's wall. Now, some walls do work. Trump's walls won't work. If I just go back one, A, you can get through it. B, there's huge gaps. C, there's a treaty between Mexico and the United States that says you cannot build on the Rio Grande floodplain, and he doesn't have the power to overturn a sovereign treaty between two nations. He hasn't got the money from Congress. He tried to appropriate the funds from the military. That has to go through Congress as well. The point is, he doesn't really need to build it. There's always a way through. He doesn't really need to build it because I think he's built it in people's heads enough to shore up the core vote, to then build on the economic success that he's having to try to get to the second term. At the moment, the economy is booming, jobs are flooding back, the dollar's really strong, shares are doing really well. His ratings are not terrible, they're not good, they're mid-40s, low 40s. He is in a position absolutely to win a second term at the moment. There's a lot of people think he's doing a great job. Again, we're just going through the ethnicities and language there. You see the down south. And there are the core voters at the top that want to keep those colors as they are, not have them come up. These are the prototypes. I don't think he needs to build them. He's built it in the wall. He just chooses one of them, builds a few dozens of miles, stands in front of it, says mission accomplished. Because if he's got the deportation numbers up and the migration numbers down, he can say mission accomplished. One of these walls, designed by a chap called Hadrian, which when you're a journalist is just gold dust. You think, oh, yeah, have that. They still haven't chosen the one because they still haven't got the funds to build it. I wanted to share the views of one of Mexico's eminent political philosophers. He's up there with, I don't know, Hegel. His view of this.
Están aquí. Miren, bañador. Las chanclas. Todo despeinado porque no me dio tiempo nada ponerme las chanclas y el bañador. Voy a la playa, había subido la marea. Tú, había subido la marea y encontré una paella. ¡Asómate, mira dónde llega el agua! Llegaba el agua hasta el restaurante. Había subido la marea.
He's up there with John Stuart Mill, as far as I'm concerned. Name that film. Yes. Yeah. The walls in each chapter are the vehicle to tell the story of the increasing divisions, and one of the manifestations of the increasing divisions is social media. It's pretty ugly out there, and it's allowed this sort of vitriol to come up and bubble up, whereas before you had to make much more of an effort. Now it's very easy. You know, we see it particularly on Twitter, but it's pretty universal on all the platforms. Of course, there's many good things about social media, but there's also the dark side. When I was a kid, when I first heard about the French writing green letters to the German occupiers about their neighbors and denouncing them, I thought, well, we would never do that. Twitter's made me change my mind, sadly. Zuckerberg said a version of it in 2011 when he first started, repeated it in 2017. He now accepts he was naive. He has not brought the world closer together. Often we are in our social media tribes. There is the plus side. There are the groups that come together, the bird watching groups. I'm in one, Leeds United. That's why we have to finish on time. Millwall versus Leeds, 1500. Okay. And if I couldn't make it, I would have gone on social media. We got a New York branch, and I would have made sure someone from America that was coming over got my ticket. So there's lots and lots of positive sides to it, but the negative ones are, as Maxine would say, doing my head in. That's why I carry one of those. This is the level of debate. And it's spread into politics. I don't bother with question time anymore because it's descended into a bear pit where they clearly encourage the audience to scream and shout. It's awful. It's part of our national political dialogue, and it's horrible. And not enough leaders have spoken out. I think some of Mr. Corbyn's pronouncements are a disgrace, just as, say, Mr. Johnson's pronouncement making a joke about burqas. I haven't got a problem with a point if you want to ban it, make an argument, but leave it to the comedians to make insulting remarks, not the great leaders of state, or even other just leaders of state. It's part of the cheapening of our political discourse, and it has risen up. Just to make the point that it's global, that's the Saudi-Iraq border. All of it fenced, the whole 700 miles. That's more about the projection of violence and terrorism, but it's still part and parcel of this. UAE has fenced off Oman. Saudi is fencing off some of Oman. Saudi is fencing off some of Yemen. Kuwait has fenced off Iraq. Turkey has fenced off a concrete wall, the whole 700 miles of Syria. Israel is reinforcing the Lebanese border. Jordan has built a fence to fence off Syria. We know Egypt has, for decades, fenced off Gaza. We know about the two walls, Gaza and the West Bank. Most of it is actually fence. This is in Bethlehem. This is Banksy's hotel. It's not a bad joke. The point I use this is that there's two sides to every wall. From this side, my Palestinian friends tell me about how awful it is. It's a disgrace. They're right. Barbed wire, land appropriated. If you demonstrate, you risk your life. All the arguments we're familiar with. And on the other side, my Israeli friends tell me before it was built, 3 years, several hundred people killed in suicide bombings, dozens and dozens of children. 3 years after it was built, very low killing. This wall has saved hundreds of lives. Therefore, it's a good wall. Oh, but hang on a minute, it saved people's lives. It's complicated, these divisions. It's not just as simple. And if you start from the beginning, this side's right and that side's wrong, you're never going to get over the wall. Clear divisions are rising. It used to be just Soviets and us. Then we all came together, except we didn't. There's a clear divide with Russia there. The Baltic states feel that they're on their own. I was in Lithuania this week, and they feel almost abandoned. They've reintroduced conscription there because of Russia. Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Czech Republic are known as the Visegrad Group, increasingly operating as a bloc within the EU. Poland and Hungary are on the track to having their voting rights removed from the EU. Hungary says it wants to be an illiberal democracy. The core of the EU, the Benelux countries and France and Germany, may go ahead with a sort of federal Europe, but maximum 6 countries. So you can have these concentric circles of a multi-speed Europe, but the idea of unity is dead. There is not going to be a federal Europe of the 27 countries. You know what we're doing? Probably. Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece increasingly on the periphery. This is not unity. This is an era of division. And we really thought it wouldn't come that way. But what happened was, after the Berlin Wall came down, we had a bipolar world, which was very easy. We came together for the perceived threat. I would argue the other side behind the Iron Curtain came together because they were forced to by the dictatorship of the Soviet Union and repressed, as we saw in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, 68 and 56. You take that binary world off, you don't have a uni world, you have a multipolar world. And now all these ancient divisions are coming back up, including between East and West Germany even, because the world is more complicated when it's not a bipolar world. And it's not even just within the nation states against each other. Even within the nation states, we are beginning to rediscover old beliefs. Same in Africa. Kenya has just finished its fence with Somalia. Morocco cuts off Western Sahara with a mine and a sand berm. Zambia has fenced off Zimbabwe. South Africa has fenced off Zimbabwe. Increasing thing around the world, this is in Lagos, is to live behind gated communities. This, I think, may be a vision of the future, except we're supposed to be all loving each other as one, but I like to think that Mars at this point has attacked. Because I believe that if Mars attacks, at that point, we will all become us, and they will become them. So that's one of the hopes. Another one is in Christianity or other religions for unity. I think if Mars attacks, we'll definitely come together. I will leave you with some choice words from Mr. Trump. For those of you who are not from the United Kingdom, there is Cornwall and Devon, there's a rivalry between them, and there is a certain accent in which some of them speak.
We have so many bays. These people come up to me, they say, Donald Bay, you don't really mean you're going to build a wall, do you? And I say, absolutely, we're going to build a wall on Tamar Bridge. They go, well, you don't really mean that. I was like, I'm going to start in June and start at Bude. We're going to build a wall. It's going to be a high wall. See the Tamar Bridge there? I mean, this is a bridge you're going to need £1.50 for. Okay, you ready? Who's going to pay for the wall? Devon! Who? Devon! £100. £100. So I get a call from him at the Evening Herald yesterday, and they said, the Mayor of Plymouth said, we will not, under any circumstances, pay for the wall. They said to me, what is your comment? I said, the wall just got £10 dearer. Build that wall. 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 Build that wall.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, it wasn't boring and it wasn't depressing.
Depressed me.
You promised me, but it wasn't.
Okay.
A couple of things that just came to my mind while Tim was talking there about boundaries. Do you think this issue that we feel safe within our boundaries? You talked about the garden fence, for instance. We like our own little areas. Do we feel safe if we have boundaries?
Yes, very much so. I just think it's a sort of basic human instinct that we do like our space. We are also suspicious. I'm not going to... this argument is slightly trite, but within the triteness there's some truth. I've only just thought of it. If you've got a dog or even a cat, you'll see them go round and round before they sit down. There might be a snake there. I mean, there's not. There hasn't going to be a snake there for hundreds of years, probably. But it's in their DNA. I think it is in our DNA to still be a little bit suspicious of the other, because for so long, the other was a threat. In many parts of the world, the other still is a threat, because we have not learned to share resources. And so we retain this suspicion. And therefore, when you build your barriers, you do feel more secure. And again, it's not a Western phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. In South Africa last year, there's about 800,000 Nigerians work in South Africa. And in the rioting last year, which was targeting Zimbabweans, because of the influx of Zimbabwean workers, they also then turned on the Nigerians as well, because they are the other from another part. We've got to get over this idea that it's just us being horrible. It's a human thing.
You talked about suspicion there, and we saw pictures of the Peace Wall in Belfast, and I grew up there. And one of the things as a journalist there that people would say to me was, oh, but, we're very suspicious of the people on the other side of the wall. And then you go to the other side there, we're very suspicious of them. What are they up to? They want to get to us. So do you think there's that, and I do understand what you're talking about, the time is not right, but do you think there is that thing globally of the wall actually feeds suspicion.
Yes.
It makes people even more paranoid about what the other side might do.
And it
to
achieves
them.
a semi-permanency because, I was looking for walls that got torn down, and after the Berlin Wall, I couldn't find one. There is a certain permanency to them, and that does reinforce this division. The walls are interesting in Northern Ireland because since the Good Friday Agreement, look at the economy. And the stats tell us that people actually fear each other much, much less. But two things. One, the housing is almost as segregated as it was 25 years ago, and the schooling is almost as segregated. So they haven't actually made that leap through a growing economy. They mix more. There's a lot more friendships and social mixing, but people still retreat. Second point about that, the whole idea of the wall and the border, and this is why the number one issue of Brexit is the Northern Ireland border, because that's about lives. The rest of it is about livelihoods. If you put a camera up, someone will take it down. So we'll put 2 cameras up on the border, someone will take it down. Okay, we'll put 5 up, we'll have a policeman to guard them. At which point, when people start taking them down, there may be violence. Okay, we'll have 10, etc., etc. All right, this has got out of hand, we'll bring the army onto the border. I'm not saying this will happen, but there are enough people still left who will not accept a border, and they will take it down no matter what, and the British side will, if feel they have to, erect it. We're playing for people's lives in that aspect of the Brexit negotiations, which is why we will unlock almost all the Brexit problems, and that will be the last one, and then it'll come down to what we used to call a three-shirter. If you go to an EU summit, if it's just a bog standard one, they've sorted it all out, you take one shirt. But the diplomats used to say, three-shirter, because they knew this is going to go on
It
and on.
applies to the underwear as well, by the way. You need to bring extra underwear.
When it comes to it, this will be a 5-shirter.
I think it might even be a week. You never know. I think also just not to harp on about Northern Ireland, but I think those of us who were used to the physical border, and you would have gone through it many times as well, having grown up with it and then been without it, the difference is phenomenal. It's not just physical, though, it's mental.
Yeah, because the physical manifestation is only the manifestation of the divide that is with us. I can't go without telling you a little vignette. I went over to Northern Ireland, to Belfast, just after the Birmingham 6 were released, and I was in this, what was essentially an IRA drinking den with one of them that evening, absolutely packed. And my cameraman, a lovely chap called Billy, so you know where this is going, Billy coming from William of Orange, completely forgot myself as a young reporter and shouted across this packed IRA drinking den, "Hey, Billy!" And it was one of those film scenes when the whole room went silent. "Billy?" And they just thought, it's that idiot Englishman, it's fine. But that taught me a lesson about identity and names and how we separate from each other.
I thought during Tim's talk, one of the interesting things that came up was the fact, don't worry, you're going to the
I was
football.
just thinking,
I'm
dominating your time, sorry.
One of the things that I thought was really interesting was when we think of walls, we think of physical walls. But you were bringing out lots of different aspects there, cyber walls, language division, all sorts of things like that, social division. And it just, it actually makes it a little bit more scary, I have to say, because to me, it just sounds like we're going to keep dividing.
Yeah, I think that's possible. I think the nation state, which I never wrote off, but it was very fashionable at the end of the last century to say the nation state's finished, we're going to be city-states, the corporates will take over. I don't believe it. I think the nation state speaks to something deep in each tribe, and the British are a tribe with subdivisions, and the French are a tribe with subdivisions, etc., etc., and the nation state is their village and their city wall, and that's now growing. Schengen failed its first test soon after the terror attacks. The Schengen Agreement, where you can go across borders, was partially put down and will not be put back up. But again, this is a manifestation of these, because it's a multipolar world, and we haven't got the big blocks now acting quite as one, NATO feeling weaker because it's been undermined by Mr. Trump, the EU fragmenting, Mercosur in the Latin America has never got off from being a website, really, etc. I think we are in for a few years of increasing divisions in social media, in discourse, in politics, in going to the extremes. And the best example we have is the rise of the extreme right in Europe. It is a response to the pressures that have come, which I'll try to round this argument. So the bipolar world vanishes, the multipolar world comes up. It's almost each man for himself or each nation state for itself. Simultaneously, we have the 2008 crash. So a lot of the money runs out and you have austerity. Simultaneous to that, the rise of technology where people can start to move. And for the first time, people in a developing world can actually see for themselves what life can be like. And they begin to move in larger numbers. I would. I'm not making a moral judgment against anybody here. And so this mass migration of people comes at the same time as austerity, at the same time as the multipolar world. And we arrive at the division. And then you're going to have to add in two more factors. One, the increasing movement of peoples, and well, we have to talk to our politicians openly about it, and technology. If technology is going to get rid of 50% of the jobs, which I'm skeptical about, but that's what the experts say, why do we need massive amounts of people if all the jobs are going to disappear, especially the low-skilled jobs, which is what most people who move come to do. So again, we've got to have these conversations. Briefly, the reason I'm slightly skeptical that 50% of jobs will go is because I think other jobs may be created, but we don't even know. And I came up with an idea. 100 years ago, in 1865, in America, 65% of people lived on the land. You can imagine if you told them, in 100 years, only 12% of people will live on the land. They would say, what the hell is everyone else going to do? Now, we're talking about 50% of the jobs going. Well, there are things that we haven't even thought of. So I thought, well, okay, let me try and think of one. And I couldn't, because obviously they don't exist yet. But I did come up with an example that no one knew we needed. You go to a Chinese restaurant. In the window, there's always that cat that goes. You know it?
Yeah.
Who knew we needed those? So we will create things that we didn't even know we needed. I just don't know what they are yet. So, I'm not that pessimistic about the future, but I am a little worried that we have stalled for progress.
Just final question for me, and then get your questions ready, right? You're raring to go. Just to take it from the big picture down to the small picture and the social picture, things like gated communities, they're seen as special, they're seen as expensive. Yeah. You've got a guard on the gate. So are we turning our divisions into something to be desired?
We've always used money to remove ourselves from the hoi polloi. But it is now accentuated because I could, I never forget my mum saying to someone, saying where we lived, and this lovely woman saying, oh, yeah, we used to live there till we could afford to move out. Where was I? So we've always done that a wee bit, but the difference is I can always go, and so can you and anyone, down to Trafalgar Square or in another town to the village square where we come together as equals. The thing about the gated community is if you don't pay enough, you can't get in. And that's a growing thing. There are more and more of them. There are even now gated cities. They're building them in Lagos, where if you haven't got a permit, you must leave the city at dusk. You can come in the morning and clean everything, but you've got to get out of town. Gated cities. So this is getting rid of the public space, and that's a form of unity where we are all equal. And if you haven't got enough money, you can't come in. Second thing about them is burglary. I read a report out of South Africa, because they're huge on the gated communities down there. And again, this isn't just a white thing. The black middle class are all over Africa are increasingly moving into gated communities, especially Nigeria and Kenya, I think. They get burgled more. Because if I'm driving down a street and I'm a burglar and I look that way and there's a gated community with 60-inch plasma televisions and I look that way and there's a township, I'm going to turn left. They actually suffer more crime, more burglary than the townships.
Interesting facts. Yeah. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, who's got a question for Tim? Oh, good. You're enthusiastic. This lady here at the front. Oh, hang on, the microphone will come to you. No.
I've got a bit of a cheat, 2 questions.
Oh, yeah.
So the first one is, what sets the, if you like, nuclear size? Most of the wars you're talking about are at nation-state level, but you can see that there are other divisions. Yeah. And then the second one is, if you look around everybody here, we're all really old apart from a couple of people. Is the view that you're putting out there, what does it look like for people under 30? I'm not sure they think the same way.
Wars between nation states are actually becoming much rarer, and it's partly because of globalization, because they're going to cost a lot more for the trade, Korea being the best example of all. But within nations, there is an increase in civil wars, Syria being the best example at the moment, but there are numerous examples all over the world. There's about 3 going on in Myanmar, for example. I haven't quite worked out, nor do we have the time, about the increase in civil wars. I do have some theories which we don't have time for. On the second thing, I think the under-30s, just to choose an arbitrary number, do retain what most of us all had and still have, which is hope and belief and righteous indignation at the problems of the world. And I would argue that, as every other generation has done for the past few hundred years, they will become more like us because we all grow into our parents. But also, you will find in Europe the rise of the extreme right and the growth of the extreme left is absolutely not dominated, but is very well represented by young people. Very well represented. Orban didn't get, and his allies didn't get 75% of the vote in Hungary just from older people. The young people are can be every bit as prejudiced as we can, or realistic, depending on your view.
Thank you. This lady here. Yep.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I'd just like to ask, what would you like to happen as a result of your book, apart from raising awareness?
Well, I've had my eye on this yacht. Oh, God. Sorry, God. Well, look, I mean, it's just one book, isn't it? But okay, we all throw our pennies into the fountain and make a ripple and make a wish, so, yeah. I think it's pretty much what I said at the beginning. The open conversation, backed by a proper understanding of the factors that are at work, so that we desperately need to have this open conversation, and it's pretty much about why we are divided and the migratory numbers and the budgets. Because most people don't give two hoots about foreign policy, foreign aid budgets, this, that, and the other. They care about their lives as they are lived every day. And if someone says, oh, for our economy over the next 40 years, we need this amount of people, but they're thinking, I'm uncomfortable. Someone telling them about what's going to happen in 40 years is totally irrelevant to them. So I would rather put a lot more info out there and challenge the politicians to tell us openly, what are your plans, how are you going to pay for it, and what are you going to build as we build a new Jerusalem here? And if you can't answer it, I'm not going to vote for you.
Next question. Put your hand up, please. Let's go over to this side of the room. We'll come back, don't worry.
Oh, the other bit is I want to have this conversation without people shouting each other down, which happens a lot. Sorry, hello.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm a geography teacher. We teach about the UK North-South divide in the GCSE spec. I'm just wondering, how bad is that divide, and if you know anything about it?
So I got the North-South divide, I didn't get the question.
So I'm asking, where does the North-South divide begin, and how bad is the North-South divide in the UK?
That's a good question. It's controversial. Go on then, you're going to solve that one, Tim.
In statistical terms, it's there, clearly. Wage, unemployment, and then in accent, slightly in voting patterns, but not so much. Yeah, I mean, there is a clear divide. And it is well known in our heads. I wrote a book a few years ago, pardon my swearing in public, but called Dirty Northern Bastards. And the back cover was called Soft Southern Bastards. And it was about football chants, but it wasn't really. It was about how we talk to each other and our cliches and stereotypes. The reason of the title of the book was that both those chants are based in the Industrial Revolution. We are dirty northern bastards who work hard and we do all the work. You lot all drink white wine and watch French films that are subtitled. So it's there in our heads. Sorry, so while I agree that the stats actually say there is a proper divide there and it is unfair, I think in our heads we are less divided than well-meaning journalists who want to write a very good story about we all hate you or whatever. Britain is still, even in Scotland and England, it's actually a fairly united place compared to many places I've been to. I think it's overstated. In our emotional divides, I think we're quite unified. Statistically, we are divided. And that's not good for long-term democracy.
Thank you. The lady over here.
You talked about the nation state being mostly about tribes and people of a certain tribe wanting to stick together. But don't you think that a lot of nation states are totally artificial constructs? I'm thinking especially of Africa, the Middle East, and the conflicts we see in those areas. Aren't they largely to do with the fact that these nation states are not at all about tribal division, that they are artificially drawn lines which date back to colonial interests rather than the actual tribal affiliations in those countries?
Yes and no, by which I mean, you're right about the artificial states. Nigeria is a great example. We drew the lines, taking no notice of geography, language, and culture, and said, you are all Nigerians. In Nigeria, there's about 15 different major ethnic groups who were all essentially nations. You know, some of them speak different languages, different religions, etc. And we said, right, you're all one people. And they've made a reasonable job at creating a nation state out of it. But it is struggling now. I mean, the Biafrans were slaughtered in their hundreds of thousands for having a temerity to try to escape this nation state because one of the dominant groups said, you're not going and we'll kill you if you try to go. And that is happening. And it's happening in lots of places. Another good example, in Angola, there's a Bantu-speaking people, and then in the country next to it, which I've forgotten above it, there's another Bantu-speaking people. In the country above them, there's another Bantu-speaking people who all used to think of themselves as a very loose nation through language, culture, intermarriage. And now they're in 3 different countries. And yet we created that. Where the no bit comes in is that they were fighting each other a long time before we showed up. There was mass slave movements a long time before we showed up. And even if we hadn't created these difficulties, which have made things harder and worse for these countries, I don't see why they wouldn't be fighting anyway, because everybody else seems to. So basically, I don't beat myself up about it, but I'm aware of history and to a degree the responsibility that the European colonialists have because of that history.
Good question, thank you. We've got a gentleman over here. And then this block here, start thinking. In the essence of fairness, we haven't had anyone from here yet.
So, question about mass migration. Having a failed state in Libya has clearly enabled mass migration into southern Europe. Now, I remember the political debate in the UK about intervention in Libya, and absolutely nobody saw that coming. And someone who had used the prospect of mass migration and the political chaos that would follow as a reason for not intervening would have been laughed at. Why do you think we're so bad at seeing what might happen next?
Because it's in the future. I don't mean that, aggressively. That is why. A lot of this goes back to there's R2P, responsibility to protect, which is adopted by the United Nations, that we all have a moral responsibility to protect people, which goes against the Westphalian piece of Europe in the 16th century, which is that each nation state can do what the hell it likes inside its own borders. Gradually, in the second half of the 20th century, R2P, responsibility to protect, grew. Mr. Blair, who at the time was a very, very influential world leader, I think it was the 1997 Chicago speech, talked about intervention, liberal interventionism, for all the best reasons to intervene, not for conquest. It was successfully carried out in Kosovo and saved a lot of lives. It was successfully carried out in Sierra Leone, and then I think drunk on that success, it was tried out elsewhere and failed horribly. It has now stopped us from intervening in Syria. You can make a strong argument that we should have done, and we could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, but because we don't know the future, we may have added to the problem. We don't know. So sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad, depending on which side of the political fence you're on. Oh, I support this side, therefore I do want intervention, or I support that side, therefore I don't want intervention. I mean, intervention, I think, liberal intervention as a concept, I think is good. But yeah, you better choose it very, very wisely, and we clearly didn't. So specifically on Libya, I admit I didn't. I was there. I was in Benghazi. I saw the armored columns that were bombed by the French and Americans and Brits 2 or 3 miles outside of Benghazi. The columns that would have come into that city and murdered thousands of civilians. There's no question that would have happened. They were just outside. They were on their way. Last-minute intervention. So they saved thousands of lives, and then the whole thing fell apart because we didn't understand it, and thousands of lives were cost. I remember going to see the first ambassador, the first British ambassador, acting consul, came from Rome, I think, just to oversee stuff. And I remember saying to him, hang on, this isn't really a state. Benghazi has its own history. Tripoli has its own history. They're very different culturally. They're only knitted together by the Italians. The Romans never thought for a moment of it as one geographic space. Even the sea lanes go in different directions. From Tripoli, they go towards Europe, and in Benghazi, the sea lanes take you towards Egypt, and that was always the trade. You know, they are very different places, and I think if that sort of knowledge was better known by our diplomats, they could have worked out that this place will fall apart. But to go back to the original question, I do think that liberal interventionism, some people support it sometimes, but only when it suits them. I think you can make a case for it, but then choose it wisely.
Final question over here. Because you can see he keeps looking at his watch. He's worried about
No,
football.
I'm just worried about
You're worried about the football.
You know, we've all got homes to go to. I hope.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Briefly mentioned about a wall dividing those who have and those who haven't, right at the beginning with resources. Could you expand on that with things like water, the resources of the planet, those who have water, oil, land for growing things and so on.
That's
and
what
also,
the whole book's about.
And also 2/3 of the planet is water.
Yeah, sadly, most of it's saline. That's what the book is about. Basically, resources. Because the moment you have competition for them, that's when the divisions begin. When you're having your Christmas lunch with your family, you're not thinking, that's my bit, and that's my, it's there to share amongst this family. And this is what the problem comes when we think there are enough resources. Now, there is enough food in the world. We do have the technology and the ability to get it to everybody. There is enough money in the world. I personally argue strongly for an increase in the foreign aid budget, which no population ever supports, majority of, anywhere. I'm doing it for selfish reasons. I think it'd help us and help that place if it was stable there and stable here. Water, you mentioned, is a big one. Ethiopia and Egypt have a massive problem. The Ethiopians are damming the Nile. People have been talking about water wars for 30, 40 years. It hasn't happened, but that's a potential. The Euphrates is another one for water wars. All the water of Pakistan comes out of India. The Indus comes out of the Himalayas in the Indian part of Kashmir and then into Pakistan, so they could cut it. That would be an act of war if they did. Both countries have water stress. But, this is a positive, India and Pakistan have a great treaty going back 40 years, which is no one's ever gone near attacking that because they know that's an existential threat to the entire country. Cut the water, war immediately. So, all these different stresses and strains and desertification and the climate change are all about resources and sharing, and the less we share it, the more people are going to move. There's a line in the book, if we don't move more money to where most of the people are, many of the people are going to move to where the money is. And I just don't think that's good for anybody. So that is the essence of the book. Having depressed myself, two brief things. One, there was a headline written by someone about 4 years ago, and it's true. depending on how you measure extreme poverty. But the line is, for the last 37 years, you could write this headline every day. Yesterday, 130,000 people were lifted out of extreme poverty around the world. That is actually the direction of travel. The other one is Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, which makes an argument to support Enlightenment values, because it's the Enlightenment values that have got us to where we are, and it's pretty good. When I give a talk in schools, I say, would you rather be a king, King Henry VIII, or like gold, or now on the 10th floor of a tower block? Oh, King Henry VIII. I said, right, Elizabeth, yeah, Elizabeth, okay. Well, she suffered from incredible toothache her whole life. So you can have all the gold you want, but you're going to have really, really bad toothache every day. Or you can just go to the dentist. And most people choose now, because we live like kings, is the point I'm making. But to round it all off, again, part of the book is to say, I do think because of these increased divisions, we risk stalling that development at the moment. I was in Italy just before I went to Lithuania. Salvini, the interior minister, has just backed down. You no longer have to have your child inoculated against measles, because these idiots at the highest levels of government believe it's a conspiracy theory to inoculate, and you shouldn't, it's damaging everybody. You know, this is 16th century thinking, and they're in the government. The compromise, everyone thought they'd back down. This is the Liga, it used to be called the Northern League, with Five Star, who've got some crazy ideas, also 16th century, and they're in charge of Italy. The compromise was, okay, you don't need, you no longer, sorry, you used to have to bring a certificate from a doctor, my child has been inoculated. Now you just have to say they've been inoculated. This was the compromise. And there's going to be a horrible outbreak of measles in Italy, and people may well die because of a retreat from Enlightenment values. And that's where we are now, because after decades of coming together, especially after the shock of the Second War, your historical memory fades. You forget the raison d'etre for the EU, which is to stop us fighting each other. So we need to keep A, the historical memory, and B, a sense of perspective that we have been going like that. And in order to keep going like that, we better not divide ourselves from one another.
And on that more optimistic note, ladies and gentlemen, Tim Marshall.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.